Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting in the Edinburgh Trade Union Council series of Tuesday night meetings on the issue of COVID. This meeting, as you're probably aware, is on long COVID, a problem that's only probably recently been noticed, wide scale, but is certainly now starting to be taken seriously. Unfortunately, of course, I know, and I'm sure others don't know as well, that probably workplaces aren't going to be taking it that seriously. My name's Eileen. I will be chairing this meeting. I'm on the Trades Council. I'm also a member of EIS ULA and the Trades Council Executive. We have two speakers this evening. We'll have the two speakers. They'll have 10 minutes each, and then we'll open to the floor, and I'm sure there will be quite a number of interesting contributions. And our first speaker is Fiona Robertson, who is a disability activist. Some of you may already have heard her speaking on this issue because she's spoken at some Zero COVID meetings as well. She's also the SNP Equalities Officer. And over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and especially since trade union involvement is going to be absolutely essential in how we go forward from this. This is so many of the responses could have been so much different, as I'll get to, but a strong union movement is essential to having that, and especially with so many gig workers being involved in the essential services responses, then it means that too many people were not covered and not protected. So I want to talk mainly about long COVID itself. So a year ago in March, I wrote a series of threads and blog posts, which was in line with what a lot of other disability activists and disabled people were writing at the time. It was at the very beginning of our understanding that this was going to be a global pandemic. And what we were trying to counter was the UK government had begun talking about a herd immunity strategy, despite what they're now trying to say. A herd immunity was their initial strategy. We were still talking about the virus as if its course was you get it and then you die or you recover. But that's not true. The other course is not die, but not recover either, or recover, but not to previous health. The disability community is full of people who got there because of the aftermath of viruses. Previously healthy people who, long after the virus itself was gone, were living with pain, exhaustion, cognitive dysfunction. When I was 19, I woke up one day and I couldn't walk properly. Over the next few months, my ability to function disappeared day by day until I was mostly bedbound. As a young woman living with pain and exhaustion, I was told, of course, that it was attention-seeking or psychosomatic or lying. And eventually they decided it was either the result of a head injury or a post-viral fatigue syndrome caused by a severe bout of flu. I had recovered, but it had taken its toll. Many, many, many years later, I would discover that it wasn't just ME, but the post-viral effects had activated the acute form of an underlying undiagnosed genetic condition. Viruses can have catastrophic effects on a person's health long after they've technically recovered from them. I lost everything. The career in theoretical physics that I've been working towards, I've never been able to get back to it because the cognitive disruption makes the complex maths out of my reach. Even though I walk again now, I need a stick. I lived with chronic pain, immune and gastrointestinal issues, and it's 20 years later. It's not like we didn't have warning that long COVID would exist, even if it was just disabled people warning about it. The SARS outbreak was another coronavirus, and it left lasting effects on a large percentage of the people who'd recovered from it. After 2 years, many were still experiencing ongoing fatigue. Many needed medication to stay employed. Many had not made it back to work at all. A year ago, I wrote, "This is one of the major reasons that Boris's herd immunity idea was so catastrophically dangerous. Just letting everyone get it will lead to a massive uptick in people experiencing post-viral symptoms, many of whom will go on to become permanently disabled. There are also going to be people becoming disabled because they have conditions going unmanaged in the chaos that are secondary risks to the virus. And those people will all then be entering a system designed to cause trauma and hardship at the exact same time. The DWP already can't process what it needs to process because the system's been designed to be cruel and labyrinthine, and most resources are poured into tribunals. So we begged the DWP to suspend protocols requiring the assumption of fraud, to pour resources into making sure newly disabled people were able to take the rest they would need to avoid worsening post-viral fatigue syndromes and symptoms and turning them into chronic conditions. We wanted waiting times to be slashed, the presumption against the applicant abolished, interim measures to provide for applicants to be available from the moment of application while waiting for it to be processed. And we were ignored. There was a failure to understand this reality and plan for it at the beginning. Instead of when a lot of people discovered for themselves what grave and systematic violations of the human rights of disabled people from the UN CRPD judgment against Westminster actually means. As the first articles about long COVID began to show up, with people calling it mysterious, our focus shifted somewhat. A few people suggested something I genuinely think is a good idea, that every long COVID patient should be assigned a mentor with ME to teach them how to navigate the systems, to advocate for themselves with doctors, and to recognize and recover their own sense of self in a world where we're programmed to believe that a disabled life is worthless. But that last part, unfortunately, turned out to be true. Other things we warned about at the beginning, because our experiences with the medical profession are not the same as able people's, were the prioritizing of able people's lives, even when there was no difference in the likelihood to survive, the assumption that a disabled person's life was of lower quality, ignoring us raising concerns about our conditions. We now know that a disabled man in England and Wales is more than 6 times as likely to die of COVID. Disabled women, 10 times as likely. We also know from long experience that women are not believed when we report concerns and symptoms. These things are not likely to be unrelated. Nearly 2/3 of the people who've died from COVID were disabled. And everywhere, for a year, we've seen what was previously hidden under veils of politeness and euphemisms come clear. We are expendable if it saves the economy, if it means able people aren't inconvenienced. Even now, the rush to reopen everything while sentencing disabled people to never leaving their homes again is being pushed by people with power while we keep yelling from the sidelines about the cost. Everything in this next government is going to be affected by this catastrophic failure to contain the virus. We didn't have enough accessible housing to begin with. We didn't have an accessible infrastructure to begin with. And a whole lot of people, as particularly women, people of color, and already disabled people are discovering, the medical system does not deal well with post-viral chronic conditions like this. They're still recommending treatments known to worsen conditions, still referring to it as controversial. And even the ones who recognize the severity of it are saying things like, "This isn't a post-viral syndrome, this is real." In terms of what we need to do next, disabled people must be at the heart of this. Imagine how different all this could have unfolded if disabled people had been listened to over the years. Remote learning and working, which we've been told was literally impossible for years. It took 2 weeks to set it in place, would have already been in place and ready to scale up, with the associated safeguards like employers paying for increased bills at home, possible harms and isolation already addressed and understood, with solutions in place, and crucially, a medical and social security system ready to deal with the challenges of chronic illness and the decisions on how support needs to be given. There are opportunities coming out of this, making sure flexibility is built into work and education, different approaches to social lives and interactions, more awareness of the effects of isolation, which disabled people have been living with all along, and community solutions to that prioritized, and a transformation in how medical professionals see people who have long-term conditions, which are not easily managed and not easily cured. The respect and recognition of mutual aid groups is one of the most positive effects I've seen come out of this. They need to continue and be organized properly. And all of that requires putting disability justice at the heart of the programs. There is nothing this won't affect. Work, businesses, housing, the economy, health and social care, community endeavors, workers' rights. It's worth pointing out that so many of the community endeavors and social care ran on volunteers who were in vulnerable groups and who have now died. We are also aware of how quickly we'll be forgotten again if everything goes back to normal. How quickly it's assumed that it's okay with us that we'll just shield forever to avoid the magnified risk we face, even while measures to mitigate lockdowns are stripped away. We already struggled getting out into our communities and lives, so please don't sentence us to an even more isolated, even more high-risk life, when if we'd only been listened to in the first place, we might have been able to avoid so many of the worst effects of this pandemic. And crucially, when it comes to the people who have long COVID, who have had COVID and are going back into their workplaces, it is absolutely vital that people are given the space to rest. The rest is important. Too many people are being forced to go back to work as quickly as possible. And if they have any post-viral symptoms, that is something which can exacerbate a post-viral syndrome and turn it into something long-lasting. Almost everyone I know with conditions like this made themselves much sicker than they needed to in the early stages, because we were all programmed to believe that we just needed to beat it and not give in to it and push through it. So this initial phase is one of the most crucial aspects for workers' rights. So please include disabled people in all of the planning. We have a lifetime of problem solving and a lifetime of ideas. And if we are part of this planning, then the systems that we build will be much more resilient for when this happens again, because it will happen again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And that really does actually show us how big, you really have demonstrated how big the problem is. And we'll move on to Kathy now. Kathy, among many other things, is a member of Scottish Hazards. But if she wants to say more about herself, I will let her say that. Okay, Kathy? Kathy? Ah.
New intern, unmute yourself.
Right, welcome.
Okay. I was just saying that I welcome the chance to speak today, and thank you for inviting me. And I am speaking with a number of different hats on, but mainly from Scottish Hazards, which is, I'm sure most of you know, is a health and safety activist group that also provide information, advice and support to mainly non-unionized workers. I won't be saying much about long COVID itself. Fiona's done such a good job of telling us what this is like for people, but rather I'm going to talk about the impact it's having on people's lives in terms of work and income, and what we can collectively try in Scotland to do about lessening that impact. just a little bit of background, which you probably have heard me speak about before, but I think it's important to say it. We have large sectors of the workforce who are on low pay and precarious contracts. We have wholly inadequate sick pay arrangements for most workers. Many workers only have statutory sick pay at £96 a week, which is not enough to support a family, and which only runs for 28 weeks maximum. And there are also, of course, people who don't even qualify for that. We've seen during the pandemic the implications of this for test and protect and self-isolation. Government support schemes, the furlough, support for businesses and support for the self-employed, payments for those on low pay who have to self-isolate have all been very welcome. But there are many people who've fallen through these safety nets. There are major concerns about the change in July when employers have to pay more for furlough, and also when furlough ends in September. We really don't know what the impact of that is going to be on a whole range of people. We have an enforcement system that's weakened by years of underfunding and political undermining. Do you remember Health and Safety Gone Mad? The get rid of red tape, bunkers, conkers. We've had a consistent kind of attack really on good health and safety enforcement. This has been shown starkly by the lack of enforcement during the pandemic. Our research shows that 784 workplace outbreaks have taken place in Scotland from March to March. We actually believe that's a big underestimate, but that's what's been recorded. And only 87 investigations by the Health and Safety Executive or Environmental Health have taken place, and very, very little enforcement action. There's major concern about COVID falling between a public health, seen as a public health issue, and an occupational health issue, with Public Health Scotland and the Health and Safety Executive, each in a sense saying the other has major responsibility. Worldwide, the International Labour Organization estimates that there should be one labour market inspector. So that could be safety, or it could be on minimum wage, but basically one labour inspector per 10,000 workers. To meet this, the UK would need 1,797 more inspectors. And the ETUC research shows that only 1 out of 171 workplaces, so 1 for every 171 workplaces, were inspected during the pandemic. This has to change. And we in Scotland, in the Scottish Hazards, together with the STUC, are calling very loudly, and have been, of course, for a long time, for the devolution of health and safety legislation, funding and enforcement to Scotland. We know it wouldn't be perfect, but we think we could do better if it were devolved to Scotland. We know of failures at UK and to some extent, lesser extent, in Scotland to heed warnings and take preventative measures in good time regarding COVID. A reminder of this is linked to our subject today. There are calls being made to the UK government to roll back on its decision to not require masks in secondary school. Campaigners point to the statistics showing that as many as 43,000 children and 110,000 education staff across the country could now be living with long COVID as symptoms persist for more than 5 weeks. Another reminder is the concerns of trade unions and Scottish Hazards about the imminent reopening of many workplaces, which have been up to now deemed as non-essential. Some of these will not have adequate risk assessments. Some of these will not have adequate mitigations in place. And with weak enforcement, that makes it even more concerning. Another reminder, which is a specific one, but I think I'll mention, is that in the last wee while, we've had 4 cases of pregnant women over 28 weeks pregnant, seem to be at risk from COVID, some with other underlying health issues, and some from minority ethnic groups, being refused furlough or medical suspension on pay, even when measures taken in the workplace are not adequate to protect them. I should add that 3 of the 4 I'm speaking of just now have been resolved, but we're still working on this, and it is concerning as we move forward into a situation where a lot more people will be being called back to work. Moving on to long COVID specifically, we've heard from Fiona about the impact of chronic conditions like long COVID. I'm not going to speak directly to that, except to say I was really overwhelmed to read a list of recognized symptoms of long COVID. It was 2 pages long. It included respiratory systems, breathlessness, chest pain, palpitations, fatigue, fever, neurological symptoms, cognitive impairment, sleep disturbance, dizziness, abdominal pain, nausea. You know, I could go on, tinnitus, earache, sore throat, dizziness. It was overwhelming, and it must be incredibly overwhelming to people who are actually suffering it, even if they've only got a percentage of these symptoms. The other thing that I learned, which is a bit more positive, from the from a guide from ACAS, which is the Advisory Arbitration, Conciliation and Advisory Service, is that they are developing categories of COVID. So they're not, I think it's good that research is going into looking at different categorizations of people. So we've got acute COVID, which is up to 4 week symptoms. What they're calling ongoing symptomatic COVID-19, which is signs and symptoms from 4 weeks to 12 weeks. And then post-COVID-19 syndrome, which is that lasting more than 12 weeks. I'm not saying that's going to solve anything, but I think it's good that, you know, there's been a bit more nuanced approach to this. And again, I would welcome the production by ACAS and the Society of Occupational Medicine of guidance for employers. These spell out what good employers can do to support those with long COVID, and I would argue what good employers should do to support anyone with a chronic illness. These include good communication, good sick pay, keeping in touch, making a plan to come back to work, having an occupational health report done, and crucially, I think, being willing to make reasonable adjustments without the person having to prove they have a disability under the Equality Act. And one of these would obviously be to avoid discrimination. And I think one of the reasonable adjustments, which Fiona's talked about, is the recognition that people need rest and that they need pacing, and that also the symptoms will come and go. It's not going to always be the same one day or the next. Also, the ACAS and SOM guidance is recognizing that long COVID impacts more on older workers, women, and minority ethnic employees, and that needs to be taken into account. Now, many employers will follow this guidance, but some won't. And we have to advise, you know, remember, this is advice, not law. So our concern is not the employers who will do all these things, but the ones who may not. And also, I thought, in relation to treatment of long COVID, there is a recognition in the guidance published by the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network and at UK level by NICE of the need for rehabilitation involving multidisciplinary services. So the recommendation is that if you referred for rehabilitation, you'll be assessed by a team who are from different services and will be able to look at the whole of you, your physical, your psychological aspects of rehabilitation. And an additional recommendation is that your healthcare professional would be able to support you with talking to your employer about returning to work, or talking to your school or college about continuing your education, for example, by suggesting a phased return. So we welcome all of this. But again, we have concerns that it really will become a reality and easily accessible to people. And I just want to note one more thing before I go on to some more negative things, is that I understand the Scottish Government and the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, have both initiated research into long COVID. in order to identify important steps to take in preventing, identifying and treating the condition. So I think we should welcome that and hope that that research will fill in some of the gaps that we have. I want to go back to sick pay briefly. As I said at the start, the situation is not good in the UK. The public sector is somewhat better in that it provides, in some cases, up to a year of sick leave, but this can still be inadequate for something like COVID-19 with unknown lengths of symptoms with long COVID. We're very pleased that in Scotland, unlike England and Wales, this 1 year has been extended further for at least healthcare staff. But as I said before, the public sector is only some workers, and for many workers, sick pay doesn't even exist. We need a complete overhaul of our sick pay system urgently, and we have for years. I suppose we're a little bit hopeful that COVID may be a spur for this, but I guess that is a watch this space one, really. A major issue I want to talk about now is the UK's failure to designate or prescribe COVID-19 as an occupational disease. If this were the case, then sufferers from long COVID would be entitled to a benefit called the Industrial Injuries Disablement Benefit, a benefit which is based on an individual's level of disability and gives them long-term financial support. There are strong calls being made by trade unions and some politicians for this to be done. There are even stronger calls at international level for COVID-19 to be designated an occupational disease by both the International Labour Organization, the EU and individual countries, which would entitle millions to financial support. The Uni Global Union has done a survey of 181 national and regional jurisdictions. That's 124 countries, 37 United States, 13 Canadian provinces, and 7 Australian states. I go into this detail because Scotland is on the verge of inheriting industrial injuries disability benefit from the UK as part of further devolution of social security. Sadly, this won't happen soon enough to impact immediately on those suffering long COVID now. However, it's crucial that we're aware of this and that we lobby strongly for a better system in Scotland. The Uni Global Union survey looked at, among other things, whether COVID-19 is recognised as an industrial disease, whether there is presumptive law policy for health workers or all workers, I'll explain that in a minute, whether there are good sick leave systems, and how well all of these are implemented. Top of the list were Argentina, Austria, Sweden, France, and Spain. The UK came somewhere in the middle with worse rankings than many US states. Sadly, the top 10 ranking jurisdictions cover only 2% of world workers, and just over half of the jurisdictions recognize COVID as an occupational disease. However, even when COVID-19 is recognized by governments, they are often unjustly denying benefits because workers can't prove they contracted the virus on the job. I hope it's okay if I go into a little bit of detail here, but I think it's important because I think we need to be pushing this in Scotland. Occupational diseases are illnesses or conditions contracted through work. While demonstrating an injury at work is usually straightforward or sometimes straightforward, it's significantly more difficult where an illness is circulating in the community, as you can imagine. In many of these cases, the burden of proof is put onto the workers to show medical evidence that can link the disease directly to the workplace. Clearly a difficult, if not impossible, thing for an individual worker to do ever, and particularly not with COVID, the way it is a community and an occupational disease. To remedy this situation, some governments have adopted presumptive laws or policies, meaning that the illness is assumed to have occurred on the job. These regulations consider best practice by occupational safety experts, shift the burden of proof from workers to employers and regulators who should ensure safe working conditions. For COVID-19, the link to the workplace has become a major issue of contention because community viral loads have been very high. Presumptive language is therefore the best policy as it enables workers to get immediate access to benefits. But too few governments are doing this. And this would parallel what Fiona said and others have said about calls for presumptions of this kind with other benefits to hurry up the process. In the UK, occupational disease prescription lies with a body called the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council. IAC's rules regarding what constitutes an occupational disease are far stricter than many countries. IAC relies on research to make its decision, but it has no research facility or funding. Many academics and others argue that the prescribed occupational diseases in the UK leave out many important ones, including some which impact mainly on women, Black and minority ethnic workers, and precarious workers. So, and even while acknowledging that statistics show that workers in relation to COVID, workers in sectors including social care, healthcare, transport, food processing, and retail have a more than double risk of contacting COVID. That's IAC's strict criteria, more than double risk. They still say, IAC still says that research evidence on many points is insufficient and they therefore cannot at the moment act. It may take them a year to try to decide whether to prescribe COVID as an industrial disease. There's a bill going through the Scottish Parliament which would set up a Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council which would address many of these problems. A consultation on the bill received almost unanimous support for such a body that would be able to carry out its own research and would have a more participatory approach with better representation from workers. This may not be in time to aid current long COVID sufferers, but would be in time for future victims of that and other emerging work-related diseases. So I think it's one we really need to work on. Thank you for the opportunity to ride a few of my hobby horses. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That was very informative. Probably a little longer than we expected, but it was such valuable information. I'm sure everybody was quite happy to listen. Yes. Could I just make sure that everybody knows how to raise their hand? If you do use the reactions button if you've got one. I think there's an alternative as well, if anybody wants to fill in on that. If anybody is really stuck with the hand thing, I have got you all on gallery, so I will keep a lookout for anybody madly waving, okay, as well. I thought first, before we take any contributions or longer questions, I will just ask if there's anybody who's got a question for either Fiona or Kathy that's effectively come straight from their talk, a point of clarification or something like that. A quick, any quick questions of that type? Or everybody feels quite clear and clarified, do they? Okay, well, if that's the case, then I will just go straight to taking contributions and questions from the floor. As yet, I seem to have no hands. Oh, yes, I probably do. Okay, Des.
Yeah, I suppose this is a question to Fiona, really, that as a trade union official, I've represented quite a lot of people who've had disabilities, and I've negotiated over reasonable adjustments or disability leave. I've explored the role of being a disability advocate in the workplace. But of course, I never thought of this role or the Equality Act in terms of long COVID, because it's up until now, it didn't meet the definition of, or the supposed definition of a disability, which means you have to have a condition which lasts a year or can be expected to last a year. But now we know that the condition can last a year or more. So that means that it becomes very important in the workplace, because people have enhanced rights. People have a right to reasonable adjustments be negotiated, and a lot of things as well, including disability leave. They have an enhanced right to representation, to have disability advocates represented in all sorts of meetings. And so I think the Scottish Government has a big role in establishing that COVID-19 meets, within the public sector, meets the definition of a disability under the Equality Act. And I think if the Scottish Government was able to say that publicly, to encompass the whole public sector in Scotland, I think would be a big step forward. So what I'm asking Fiona is, do you think, Fiona, that the Scottish Government will ever in the near future make such a statement?
I hope so, is the short answer to that. I think that there's one of the important things to recognize with the Equality Act and with the kind of definitions of disability is that while if you are challenged by your employer, then you do tend to need to show evidence of a specific condition. It isn't the specific condition which is what is classed as the disability. The disability is the set of symptoms or impairments which are causing your which are making it harder to access certain types of work or making it harder to live your life. As I'm sure you'll all be aware, then it's not technically legal for people to be asking what condition you've got unless that is specifically relevant in any given situation, because disability is based in it's the personal interaction with the world. It's not down to a specific label, and that's something that's going to be really important as we get through as we deal with long COVID specifically, because as Kathy was talking, I was making a series of notes about a lot of the things that were that she was bringing up, and a couple of them are relevant here. One is that until fairly recently, and in some cases, I'm sure it's still happening, doctors were being taught that if someone presents with more than 3 symptoms, then it's a psychogenic condition. And when you have conditions like ME, fibromyalgia, EDS, and long COVID, then you have these massive lists of, sorry, my cat is being very invasive as usual. You have these huge lists of symptoms, and you are likely to be experiencing a cluster of them at any given point. And because these conditions are often more likely to occur in women and in people of color and in poorer people, then these are conditions which are easily dismissed. And so when it comes to having the correct labels coming from the medical profession, then that's going to be a barrier. Unfortunately, it's going to be a barrier for anyone who's trying to access their workers' rights under this. So it is essential that we start looking at how we do that, how we make sure that the label is given the respect that it deserves, and the people who have it are given the respect that they deserve. But it's also important that within that, we have some discussions about the reason why it isn't the condition, it's the interaction that causes that is defined as the disability, is because within any given condition, you have a massive range of types of ability and of levels of impairment. Long COVID is going to be one of those conditions that has people who just have just need a few days off a month to rest a bit, to people who need really in-depth adjustments to be able to work, to people who are not going to be able to work any longer. Those discussions must be had as on a case-by-case basis, and that's one of the crucial things, is that we do need to have kind of larger guidelines for specific strata of types of impairment and of severities of impairment. but each person is going to experience a different cluster of symptoms. Is going to be experiencing a different way that we approach it. And one of the fears that a lot of disabled people have is that it's going to be used as a reason to keep disabled people out of the workplace again, is that these reasonable the reasonable adjustment for remote working is something that we've been pushing for years. We're told it was impossible, took 2 weeks to implement. But we are afraid that it is going to be used as a way to not make reasonable adjustments in workplaces now, because remote working is an option. Then people who do want to be either doing hybrid working or working in a face-to-face workplace, that they are going to be pushed out of that. So having these discussions, being led by the individual is a kind of change that we need to make, because at the moment, what's considered a reasonable adjustment is decided by abled people largely, and not by the person who actually requires the adjustment. Sorry, I've got way off track here. Just too many important things, but yes, I do think that having the label of long COVID is going to be essential, but I think that we're going to need to be cognizant of the fact that that label is harder to access for certain groups of people who will be treated within the medical profession, as if they are hysterical or malingering or whatever, because the profession does not deal well with these kinds of conditions. So support can't be predicated on having that label. It has to be based on what the person needs, whether or not there's they have an official diagnosis, because that diagnosis is going to be harder for women, people of color, and poor people to access. Thanks.
Fiona, you did actually have your hand up as well. Was that because you had something else to say? Or...
It was mostly the stuff that I was just talking about. One of the other things I did want to comment on from Kathy's talk was about the occupational health and rehabilitation aspects. At the moment, again, because there is a real because these conditions are both not understood and not respected, and because the people who have had these conditions have been treated with such disdain over the years and decades, there is a particular type of therapy which is still considered one of the which is already being recommended to long COVID patients, and I can't describe how dangerous this is. It's called graded exercise therapy, and it was something that was a very popular treatment back in the late 90s and early aughts, and it because it felt like it should work to people who didn't have the condition, and despite a lot of evidence that it made people's conditions worse, it was still pushed because it's based in this idea that you just do a bit more every day, or you just keep pushing yourself through pain when that's the worst thing that you can do with these conditions. I went through it back in my very early days and ended up not able to leave my bed for 6 months because of it. It made my condition significantly worse. And there was a large scale trial called the PACE trial that was used to justify this type of therapy that was eventually, due to the tireless efforts of disabled people who had been through this nightmare, it was debunked, and debunked comprehensively. But unfortunately, that message has not reached a lot of doctors who still don't have respect for the people who are going through this, and who still believe that they know better than the people who are actually experiencing how much worse it makes your condition. And so unfortunately, that is already being recommended to people. And I have a real fear that if we're talking about occupational health supports, then adherence to things like the PACE protocols will be considered a compliance directive. And if people don't comply with it, then they will not have access to the necessary support. And given how destructive and how catastrophic it can be for your health, I have a real fear that, again, it not being led by disabled people will put these things, put people at risk. So that was the main other thing that I wanted to pick up from Kathy's talk.
Thank you. And could you just ask, Leslie, you had your hand up at one point. You seem to have put it down. Do you still have a question?
Well, really, it's just about where to find the recording. Where will it be posted after the meeting? Because I want to say thank you very much to both Fiona and Kathy, and for such brilliant talks, and to yourself, Eileen, as well, for chairing. So I was just wondering, will it be on a particular Facebook page, or?
We'll be in contact about that. Sophia is in charge of all that, and she's put it up. It's on YouTube.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks again to the speakers and to yourself, Eileen. It's a great meeting.
Okay. Yes. Is it all right, Kathy? I think I'll take Kyla before Kathy, if that's all okay. Kyla? Kyla Johnson.
Hi. I guess it wasn't a question so much as I actually do have long COVID myself, and I am phasing back to work at the moment, but I'm still basically managing symptoms. The other thing is I'm nearly 100% sure I got sick from being at work. I work in tourism. At the moment, there was no checks on who was coming into the country, dealing with, all kinds of people from all over the world, especially Europe, and obviously working closely with colleagues. And also I don't work in a job that I can do remotely either. So I just felt that there's been so much adherence to protocol. Like my work have been good, but there's so much adherence to protocol that they just insist on doing rather than any flexibility, which has been quite distressing, such as, protocols around, reductions in pay. I mean, to be honest, I pretty much signed back into work because I couldn't afford what they were, I just felt like they were treating this like any other illness when this was the middle of a pandemic, when my other staff members were actually furloughed and I couldn't even go to work, but yet they were treating it the same, which I don't know. And also they refused to do a longer phased return than what I was asking for. They said if it had to be longer, then I should probably still be off work. I mean, I was lucky that when I phased back in, there was a second lockdown, and luckily for me, I had another 4 months to rest. So by the time work did start, I was feeling ready to do it. But even when I raised with the occupational health that I believe that I got this at work, they refused to put that in the occupational health, and they said I couldn't prove it. And even, my manager has been good, but for example, next week I'm going to 75%, and he was very insistent that I try certain days, full days, and I had to argue with him and say, no, I know how much it affected me going up to 50%. I really only want to do 75%. And I had to fight for it. And I don't know, I just feel so frustrated because it just feels like a fight. And I have to argue and ask for things that just seem so, I don't know. So anyway, that was just my experience. And I'm very lucky that my symptoms, you know, I have improved. But I don't know in the future how I'm going to be able to handle going back to the job I did before. And there's no way for me to do it from home. And it's anyway, yeah. So I just feel, I feel that I've been treated better than a lot of people, but I still feel very, very dissatisfied by a lot of things that have been going on at work. So that's, I just wanted to sort of say that as someone who has been through long COVID, who has been off work for nearly a year, whose SSP stopped after 28 weeks. And it's like, why would you do that to someone who got sick because of a pandemic and the government didn't even make an effort to stop it coming into this country, you know? So anyway, that's my rant.
Yeah. This trap that people get in where they have to fight for their rights at a time when they're actually so ill, it's going to make them worse, is something I've met so often. Had your hand up in any case, and I just wonder, perhaps in your contribution, perhaps you might have something to add for Kyla.
Yeah, I was going to, two things. Well, in relation to you, Kyla, I just, oh God, I sympathize so much. And I think your story is not a common one, but not an uncommon one. I mean, it probably is a common one actually, but, and I would say, I don't know whether you're in a union, but I would hope that if you are, you would have had some.
I am in a union, yeah. I joined because of this.
Right. And have you had reasonable support?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have support. I've had support from them.
Okay, because I was going to say, if people are in that kind of situation and are not in the union, well, first of all, join if you can. But if there isn't a relevant union, then Scottish Hazards, which I work with, does take up individual cases. So you know, we do try to work with people to work through the best way of negotiating with employers and that kind of thing. But in terms of what you were talking about, Fiona, and Des's question, you know, I was pleased that the ACAS code specifically says reasonable adjustment should be made and that the worker should not have to prove that they have a disability under the Act. And I thought that was reasonable. I mean, was good. I don't know, and Des will know much better than I because he does more casework, but I don't know how much employers pay any attention to ACAS guidance. This is the problem. But if it helps to be able to refer to that, that's what it says in their specific long COVID guidance.
Did you have more that you wanted to say, Kathy? Because you did have your hand up.
No, those were the 2 points, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just quickly wanted to say I'm also part of the Long COVID Scotland Action Group. So I just wanted to thank Kathy and Fiona, and I'd really like to bring back what I've heard today to the group as well, because we're obviously ourselves trying to fight for research and recognition and support for everyone as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kyla. About support from the
Eileen, we can't hear you.
I think she's frozen. Oh, there she is.
I think there is a problem, isn't there?
You were frozen for a minute, Eileen.
I was, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I was frozen for a minute. My apologies. Mike, are you with us?
Yep.
Could you? So you've actually accidentally. Oh, okay. Right, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Mike Danham from the Zero COVID Scotland campaign. I expect some or all of you will be aware of the news this week that the new Health Secretary of the Scottish Government is suggesting that the government is going to use the capacity of intensive care units as its main measure to determine relaxations of COVID restrictions. Now, this seems to the campaign to be a really important and disastrous thing. But the point in relation to long COVID is perhaps obvious to you that whatever impact or not relaxing restrictions will have on hospitalizations, it will certainly have a huge impact on increasing long COVID, and in this sense, at this very moment, the campaign's tried to take this opportunity to point this out, and which is an opportunity to raise the whole issue of long COVID. And we have a Twitter campaign, and I'm not very good at this thing, but I've tried to put something in there in the chat, so that not only are these really important individual stories made promoted and amplified, but also just to point out that the whole long COVID story is really important for us collectively, all of us in the whole community and in all workplaces, because it's a very strong argument to continue to maximally suppress the virus and to work towards the elimination of the virus, which is what zero COVID means, as most of you probably know. It's an unfortunate tag which is often misunderstood, but what it really means is a perfectly satisfactory epidemiological way of method of eliminating the virus. So I think long COVID is really important, not only for the sufferers, of course, for the sufferers, but also for all of us. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. There was also a message from Mike, which was, I think, went a long way round to get into the chat on COVID figures, if in the chat, if anybody's interested. Also in the chat, there's a question from Paul that time and time again we are reading and hearing about long COVID sufferers stating that GPs are not taking this seriously. How can this be addressed? And also, is there some sort of kit for long COVID patients that can be used to reaching out for GPs? Now, I don't know if either of our speakers have any thoughts on that. Fiona?
Just first of all, quickly to respond to Mike's comment about the ICU being used as a marker. Again, it's this failure to understand that it's not dying or surviving. It's the human cost of the kind of intermediate part, especially as the vaccine kicks in, then fewer people are going to be going into the ICU, and that's amazing. That's a fantastic thing, but it is very much not the only measure, the only metric that we need to be working on, and it's something that is I'm going to be lobbying him on, at least from within the party. So we'll see how that goes. When it comes to GPs, how can we best deal with that? Unfortunately, that requires a fundamental overhaul in the medical profession itself, across the world, not just in the UK. Meanwhile, though, I was actually quite serious when I said that every person should be assigned a mentor with ME, because this is the stuff that we've spent decades learning. We've spent decades learning how to advocate for ourselves. Many of us have had major impacts to our health because we have we haven't had that support. So getting involved with the disability community is the absolute best thing that you can do. We have the experience, we have the long-term systems of support that we give each other. The most important thing that you can do is take someone along to any investigations that you have, any appointments that you have. And if you are asking for support and they don't take it seriously, ask them specifically to note in your medical notes why they haven't followed up on that line, because that can often be something which can prompt investigation at least. But this is unfortunately a massive problem in the medical culture as a whole, is that conditions like long COVID, like ME, like fibromyalgia, they're not treated seriously. They are seen as either psychogenic, which GPs for some reason still don't understand that, but just because something is generated from the mind doesn't make it not a serious thing, and doesn't make it not a physical condition. But that's not really relevant in these cases anyway. There is this belief that people are, I think that one GP who wrote a book, I think called Confessions of a GP, in it, all the way through it, he refers to people with fibromyalgia as having shit life syndrome. And that's just not true at all. That's not how this functions. It's not how it works. And these are people who are, most people, until they have reason not to, trust doctors. So when you go to a doctor and you ask for help, then you expect to be treated with respect. You expect your condition, your symptoms, the concerns that you have to be taken seriously. And so when you're told that that it's not serious, or that it's not a thing, then it's kind of a gaslighting effect. It takes years to unpick the effects of that. It's something that we often talk about in the disability community, is that belief that if you have one day that you're not in as much pain, you immediately start thinking, oh, am I actually faking then? Because we've been told this so often for so many years. And it has a real cost. It has a real human cost, specifically, again, when it comes to conditions like long COVID, because you push yourself to do things that you're not ready for, and that will make you worse, that will make your health worse, because our entire culture is built on this idea that if you just push through pain, then that's the sign of strength. It's a moral certitude, it's a moral value. And that can't be how we deal with this, because the cost is so high on a personal level, on an economic level, on a workers level. It's we have to do better this time. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat about that perhaps people who have had long COVID from early COVID and were not actually tested might have actually problems proving that they've got long COVID. I presume that is true. Okay. Kathy, did you?
Yeah, a couple of things. I wanted to come back about to Mike and others about the criteria, and I'm not questioning the fact that there is a switch, but I was at a meeting with the Scottish Government this morning, and they did indicate that there are 4 indicators that they will look at. Now, I'm only repeating what I know, but I've just looked it up. The 4 indicators are weekly new positive cases, weekly percentage of tests that are positive. Oh, it's 5. Projected cases per 100,000, current and projected COVID hospital demand, and current and projected COVID ICU demand. So I think I'm just reacting by saying it's not fair to say it'll only be ICU or hospital demand, but they will be looking at that in relation to all the others. So I wanted to fill that in. And in relation to GPs, gosh, I don't know what to say. I mean, Fiona's really said everything. I think taking somebody with you, I used to give advice to people in the health service, and I think taking somebody with you is really important quite often, whether it's COVID or something else. The other thing that I have seen happen, but I don't know whether it would work with COVID, is for people in a community to actually ask to see the doctors as a whole, not as individual patients, but actually say, can we have a meeting with you as a practice or as a group of doctors? And just sort of depersonalize it slightly and put the points then. As I say, I don't know whether it would work with COVID because by definition, people are quite ill. And also there may not be very many in a local community, but it's just a thought.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on to Leslie, I would actually also myself emphasize the importance of support groups. I had ME for a long time, and I really did value being in a group and being able to talk to other people in a similar situation, how they deal with it. So, and there are certainly ME support groups out there, I think, who are quite happy to welcome long COVID people into their ranks. So if you do know anybody in that sort of situation, I would really recommend that. Anyway, Leslie.
Just a very quick question, actually. I'd imagine everybody here, if they're not actually involved in it, know about an organisation called Long COVID Scotland. I just found out about them recently, to my shame, and I've not really checked them out very much, but I know at least one person who was hoping to be at the meeting tonight, but unfortunately isn't.
Okay. You faded, Leslie. Leslie?
You've muted yourself.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just saying that one person that I contacted about the meeting tonight, who's unfortunately not well enough to attend, said that she'd very kindly put some information on the Long COVID Scotland website, and some people might have come to the meeting. So I was just going to say, if anybody from the organisation felt like speaking, if this is duplicating, I'm sorry to say that might be quite good, in my opinion. And the other thing I wanted to ask was, I've just found a series of meetings being run by the Royal Medical Society about long COVID next month, I think. Now, I believe that many people rightly have reservations about the Royal Society of Medicine, but I just wondered if it would be helpful if I put that into the chat so people could check it out and decide whether or not it would be worth investigating. That
Yeah.
be okay?
Yep, that sounds like a good idea. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Farouk, is that, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes, you are. Thank you, Eileen. I'm an outsider to all you folk, because you're all in Britain from what I'm working out, and possibly someone in Netherlands. I'm talking from the other end of the world, the southern tip of Africa. And our situation is so different, but yet so similar. We have an enormous number of our population is unemployed. So talking about unions and work in terms of work, the definitions are so different. But nevertheless, I've learned an incredible amount, and it's really good to have a group like your group here. We haven't had a support group. I was infected, not with my knowledge, sometime in August or September, and I'm now a long hauler, and I've actually spent 75 days in bed recently. And the very same problems that Fiona's been talking about in terms of people not actually understanding, even when you go to your doctor, and our doctors are a whole lot better than what you have in your general practices. You know, they're a lot more open. I'm quite fortunate that my GP was a student of mine, so I can kind of chastise her a little bit. And she now has turned around, and in fact, she calls me every second day and says, Mr. M, I've got this patient, and what should I be doing? And I said, but you, the medical doctor, I'm not, I'm just a virologist. And she says, yes, but you've had the experience, so tell me what I should be doing. And I was very fortunate that I managed to make contact with a support group that's out of New York that helped me to work out my life and basically help me manage this thing when I wasn't getting any help from the allopathic medical fraternity. And on Monday, we had a conversation on a radio program, and it just inspired me to actually start up a local South African support group, because we don't have one. And some of our experiences are different because the variants are different and the way in which they respond to the vaccines is different. And we have a huge scientific community. I mean, a lot of our scientists have contributed globally to the science of the variants and the gene mutations and all of that. So in fact, it's really important for us to have this linkage. So I'm really grateful for having made contact with your group, but also with the Scottish group, because I think that there's going to be quite a lot of cross-fertilization and pollination of ideas over time. And through that, hopefully kind of, build some of the linkages that we have, even though we may have large unemployed parts of our population who are not unionized at this point. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for that. Sorry if I've taken up too much time. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. At the moment, the only hand I can see is Kathy's. Before I come back to Kathy, can I just check, is there anybody else sitting there with a desire to ask a question or make a contribution? Okay, well, well, Kathy's put her hand down, but Fiona's put her hand up. So I think what I will do is ask both Kathy and we normally finish about 8 or just before 8. So it seems a sensible time to ask both Kathy and Fiona to come back and add anything they want, plus whatever it is they had their hand up for, to bring what I think has been a very useful meeting to a close. Okay, shall I take Fiona first, Kathy, or? Okay, all right. Okay, Fiona.
I just wanted to make a quick comment to about how sorry, my husband's playing a video game in the background. The global disability movement is such a huge part of. It's been such a huge part of my life, but it's definitely activated and mobilized through the pandemic. We share resources and support across borders and across continents, because we are realistically all fighting the same system. It has differing levels of severity in different places, and it has different, slightly different priorities in different areas, but it's all the kind of same system of disrespect and or lack of belief, and it's these fights that we shouldn't have to keep having. If we had been taken seriously back in the 90s, back in the early aughts, then these kind of things would have been, this whole system would have been sorted already. We wouldn't have to be having these fights for people with long COVID, because systems of addressing workplace needs, sick pay, social security support for people who are on temporary or precarious contracts, these things would already have been dealt with. And it's a real, my general point for the whole talk, I think today, is that if we are included in the planning, if we're included in decision making, then so much of this could have been avoided. And we have a real opportunity now to kind of push that home and to really make sure that people understand that the powers that be often don't actually have all of the answers, that we have been yelling about this stuff for decades now, and that we have answers, we have solutions, we have a lot of information, a lot of, as Farouk was saying, a lot of people who have come from scientific and policy backgrounds, who have discovered that it didn't protect us. It didn't stop us from becoming the people who had to fight for every scrap of access. And these are things which are the only way that we do this is by organizing and by supporting each other. That is the only way that any of us get anywhere. We can't do this on our own. Everyone, it's one of our biggest fears in the disability community is so many people getting long COVID, not realizing that they are disabled as a label, and therefore not joining our community and not getting the support that they need, and all of the decades of knowledge and experience that we have about how to deal with these systems, how to navigate these systems in ways which at least minimize the harm to you. We are really, we have so much support to give, and we welcome all of the long COVID people to come into the disability community. You're part of it. It's an essential, a necessary part of our organizing. So I'll put my contact details into the chat if anyone wants any further information, or for me to kind of come talk to anyone or help with anything, then please do give me a shout. I will be there. I'll do whatever I can. This is the work, it turned into the work of my life. So and the disability community is amazing. It has so many incredible people in it, and we do such fantastic work. And I'm just really hopeful that this kind of global singular event might actually wake people up to that. And so thank you for the chance to talk to everyone, and I will put my details in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few posts in the chat with helpful links to groups, and there's a link to that therapy, PACE therapy as well, for those who want to know more. Kathy?
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, I could have I'll just take Fiona's little speech just then and transfer it into the trade unions. I mean, I'm joking, but in a way, you know, we've been saying for years, let's do things differently. And I totally think we need to work together, absolutely, on this. And I wanted to say to you, Farooq, that I wouldn't want you to have a golden image of Scotland where everybody's unionized and nobody's got precarious work, because it's not the case. I know it's far worse where you are, but we've got a long battle to go in terms of getting good unionization, and also trying to move people out of precarious work and stuff. But the main thing I wanted to say is that Scottish Hazards is linked in to international networks of occupational health and safety and environmental campaigns, grassroots campaigns in Europe, in Asia, in the United States, Latin America. And so we're trying to look at this from a global perspective as well, which I tried to do a bit in my talk by talking about, you know, what the international unions are doing and what the International Labour Organization is doing. So it's definitely something we have to all work together on, or we're not going to get there, as Fiona said. But thank you for having me, and I hope I didn't speak too long.
Oh, no. And thank you both. There's another Edinburgh TUC meeting, Zoom meeting, in a couple of weeks' time on Wednesday, the 9th of June. It's the annual anniversary of the Grenfell disaster meeting. So the details are in the chat. And I'm sure there will be another meeting in this series too, so keep an eye open for it. And could we give the usual thanks to our two speakers before we move on? Okay, so, right. And thank you to everybody for coming, and thank you for all the contributions too. 2 new messages. But yes, they're all thank you and brava. So bye-bye.